How's it going, people? I'm very happy and pleased to introduce this episode of my podcast with Dr. Alban Urbanus. He is a professor of philosophy, as you'll go on to hear, at the University of Delaware. But his experience is much larger than this, as you'll also go on to hear. We cover a wide range of topics, obviously through mostly a philosophical lens, talking about current issues of the day like AI, or talking about how philosophy can be used to help improve your life. Some of the topics that we cover are quite challenging, but I hope that that goes on to help sort of illuminate some things that you may not have thought of before. All of that being said, I hope you go on to enjoy. Starting off generally, I think that's a good place to start. I would like to ask, why do you feel it's important philosophy be taught to students across the globe?
Right. So I think there are a number of reasons. First of all, there's a traditional reason, which goes all the way back to the beginning of inquiry and reflection on, the world and our status in the world. Philosophers were people who began to raise questions about the nature of things, the nature of reality, the nature of ethics. And this kind of, inquiry was based, at least we think, based in the experience of wonder and curiosity. If we go back to Plato, Plato would say that people, the early philosophers were wonderstruck, and they had this curiosity and wanted to know why things are the way they are. And I think that the core of that idea, the curiosity, not for the purpose of gaining, let's say, fame or fortune, or getting any kind of special advantage, but just for the purpose of learning, just for the purpose of gaining knowledge. I think something like that is extremely special and essential to the whole question of being human. And while we do need to have these like technical areas where we can build competencies, like in science and technology, in order for things to advance. We obviously need that. We need people in healthcare. We need people with very important skills to address everyday challenges. But I think at the same time, we also need to retain this almost type of like naive innocence, and just wanting to probe for the sake of probing to see where it will take us. Because other than that, if we pretty much eliminate that type of genuine, naive, innocent, journeying into questions, not knowing where they're going to lead us, then I think everything is going to be compacted into small units where there's a utility or an efficiency, or some kind of a payback, immediate payback, that's going to be associated with that inquiry. And much of what it means to be human, I think, would be lost. Now, again, we all know and that philosophy as a major in American colleges and universities really only attracts perhaps 1% of individuals who actually go into that field. But that's fine. I think, as long as philosophy can continue to emphasize the importance of taking nothing for granted, being willing to probe, being willing to raise questions, asking for accountability. I mean, that I think is really important. And although there may not be a lot of philosophy majors in the world, or minors, the idea of taking on this accountability, so to speak, searching for answers in any field that we go into, I think is deeply important. So maintaining that the philosophical spirit in one form or another, whether it's in a major, in a college or university, or having philosophical questions that crop up in any area of any discipline that we undertake, I think maintaining that is going to be deeply important. Because once we get rid of that, then we fall into approved ideologies, and you can look around the world and you can see where these approved ideologies, this is the truth. Remember, in Russian, Pravda meant the truth. That's the name of their newspaper, when in fact it was just a particular vehicle for disseminating communist propaganda. So if we do not retain genuine philosophical inquiry, we are running the risk at some point of allowing some type of, you might say, political form of ideology, totalitarian view, that could easily prevent any genuine philosophical thinking.
Yeah. So I completely agree with you. You can easily fall into this, normative sort of normative, like one-way street of ideology. And that being said, you mentioned how there's only about 1% of philosophy majors, or that it attracts 1% of college students, which that's news to me. But that being said, do you feel as if we taught philosophy earlier on in education, you might see some of those numbers start to increase, or should it be reserved for, maybe older students?
Right. I mean, I think to a certain degree, some questions earlier on could be raised, and I think you can do this in a number of ways. Certainly in the study of history, in the study of literature, I think you can begin to probe and begin to, let's say, incite the curiosity of individuals. But I do think there's a certain level of maturity, intellectual maturity, that you have to attain to really get the full benefit from philosophy. Because let's understand it. I mean, people can be put off by some of the questions and some of the efforts to attain some genuine insight. That can be hard. I mean, that can be frustrating, and you don't want to have that frustration happen early, and then later on people dismiss the whole enterprise because of their first experience, a negative experience, let's say, of doing some kind of philosophical thinking. Now, on the other hand, as I said before, I think it's always good to let people know that there are philosophical questions that accompany any particular domain, any particular area of inquiry, but let them know that that's out there, and and maybe just invite them to think about this, and that might be a better way to allow them, okay, when they're ready, to jump into it. I mean, it's I mean, in some ways it's like driving a car. I mean, we go behind the wheel when we're 16 or 18 in this country. I mean, we could probably, we let children, play with toys that look like little miniature automobiles and get them kind of acclimated to that, and that's fine,
Right.
and just to say one day you'll be able to take, ownership, or take leadership over a car yourself. But that's quite an endeavor, and it takes a lot of skills to navigate. And I think philosophical thinking, not to make it more than it is, but there are a lot of moving parts, and there are a lot of things one has to be aware of to get the full benefit from this. And in point of fact, when even in students who are let's say 18 or older, who get into reading and studying philosophy, they may, even at that age, not really be prepared to take on the questions that are being brought before them, and they may not have had some initial let's say exposure. So I do think some kind of initial exposure would be good, but I don't think definite, or let's say focused instruction should happen before college, or maybe could happen like in the senior year of high school. I know in France, where I studied, in the last year of high school, in terminale, what they call it, you would be able to take a course in philosophy, and they would allow you to take your baccalaureate exam with a focus on philosophy. So it can happen, but you really have to take those small steps first. And if those first small steps have not been taken, in the various disciplines that students are studying, then I don't think it would be a very productive enterprise.
Yeah, that's fair. I like the car analogy because a lot of the time it is so shocking to reflect on myself driving on such a young age. For
Right.
sure. So speaking on philosophical education, I really appreciated you being able to squeeze in Kierkegaard in a
Mhm.
history of philosophy class. I wanted to ask if you had any specific reason for doing so. Um, you know, besides the obvious fact of him being the father of existentialism,
Mhm.
because throughout the rest of my education, I've hardly ever seen existentialism be brought up.
Mhm. Right, right. So, in the course, that you in which you were enrolled, in the thing that we studied, the focus there was to take a look at different approaches to life. How should we view the you might say the possibilities as well as the challenges of leading a fulfilled human existence? What does that entail? And one of the reasons I incorporated Kierkegaard into that discussion is because I do think at some level, one cannot just simply dismiss religious experience or religious reflection as something that might be useful, for fulfilling, one's human potential. And so incorporated, of course, the existentialists, in particular, Kierkegaard could have chosen others, but I think Kierkegaard is very distinctive in his emphasis upon what he calls faith, and this idea of achieving a form of authentic existence, and not just simply playing by the rules and following the lead of society and trying to fit in. And I think that's really important. There's also Kierkegaard, puts a great deal of emphasis, I think, upon internal, internal rumbling, so to speak. It's kind of like this bubbling type of passion that might be within an individual that leads to creativity, that leads to some kind of spontaneity. And I think all of that is extremely important. One of the things that's interesting in philosophy, at least in the contemporary period, is that even beforehand, we tend to not give sufficient attention, I think, to the value of human emotions, to the value of human passion, and with all of the all the dangers that could be associated with giving too much attention to passion and emotion and so forth. But I think again, we cannot excise that from the question of what it means to be human. Humans are deeply passionate, they're deeply emotional, they're filled with various kinds of energies that should not be simply corralled and sanitized, but in many ways they have to be, I think, allowed to have full expression, especially at critical moments in life. And I think this is what Kierkegaard brings forward. And from the standpoint of existentialism, yes, it's important to understand that existentialism was an important movement, 19th century, 20th century, in Europe and the United States. Much of that had to do, I would say, in part, was the confrontation with the aftermath of the Second World War. Behind me, you see the background of the Normandy beach, where the Normandy landings took place. Well, the Second World War brought on a great deal of devastation around the world. Over 50 million people died, as I understand it. And in Europe, that caused some great malaise. It caused great discomfort and confusion. And at that point, existentialists were saying, what we've learned, what we've studied, what we've accepted, the fact that, there's God exists and everything is fine and we live a certain way, we'll be rewarded. That seemed to be negated by the severity, right, by the atrocious quality of what happened during the Second World War. And so that gave the existentialists room to focus more on what it means to be free from the obligations of God and so forth, and to be able, to make your own choice. Now, what's interesting here is that when you look at some of the French existentialists, like Simone de Beauvoir or Jean-Paul Sartre, then you have before that, of course, Kierkegaard. And Kierkegaard is someone who is a theistic existentialist. So I think that's where it becomes really quite interesting to see where it's not a question of repudiating what might have been suggested or taught in the past. It's a question of going beyond the surface level, because very often religion and religious instruction could be simply around ideas that have been shall we say authorized, canonized, made very official, and we leave it at doctrine. But for Kierkegaard, religion is not doctrine, okay? It's personal experience. It's a confrontation with the absurd. And I think that important step really needs to be taken into account and given time for us to reflect upon, because it is so singular, I think, in many ways, and so vastly important, for someone who wants to know more about, what it means to be human when you don't have all the answers to questions. And some of the pat answers that are given to you by society just simply seem to fall short. And there's this opportunity for us to delve further. And what we're trying to get at is not necessarily scientific or technological knowledge, but more a kind of an insight about what we are as human beings, what are our anxieties, what is our lack, and how can we use our emotions, our emotive self, to gain traction and trying to resolve some of the issues we're trying to resolve.
Yeah. No, I really appreciate you constantly, referring back to the question of what it means to be human. And Kierkegaard is so fascinating to me, especially considering I have a very extensive religious background that did fall back on on a lot of doctrine. So like someone like Kierkegaard to me is very, very fascinating and interesting, and as well as Dostoevsky. I'm not sure how much he was more of a believer in the sort of individual religion. But as far as reading him goes, it definitely gives that indication.
Sure, sure,
Um,
definitely. I mean, I could have used easily Dostoevsky, and of course, looking at the question of life, human life, and so forth. As you know, when you have a 16-week semester and you're trying to be as comprehensive as you can be and give the different sides of a question, then you have to make choices. And but Dostoevsky is certainly is a very important figure. Walter Kaufmann at Princeton, as you may know, when he put together, he was one of the other. Kaufmann is a person who was really central in bringing existentialism to the attention of philosophy departments in the United States in the 20th century. He did a lot of translations, and one of his books was called, Existentialism, from, I think, Socrates to Dostoevsky or something like that. But Dostoevsky was really important, and is important as a thinker for us, if you're looking at this kind of reflection upon the human condition, what it means to be human. And so certainly, if I had more time, I would have definitely included, something like, the Brothers Karamazov or something like that within the framework of what we would be doing in our course. But Dostoevsky is definitely an important figure, definitely.
yeah, I definitely understand 16 weeks is for a class like that. It makes complete sense. We got more towards modern history when you talk about World War II and all those things. How do you feel about the current situation of philosophy today? I get that's a very, nebulous question, but if there are any, very interesting major debates to you, or as potentially you feel like the space is positive right now, or if it's negative right now, anything along those sorts of lines.
Well, yeah, I would say that I think we're in a kind of a holding pattern, if I can say put it that way. That is to say that there was a great deal of excitement at the beginning of the 20th century in the Anglo-American world with the development of techniques in logic and the emergence of what's called logical positivism and the ability to potentially push aside some inherited questions in philosophy because of emerging logical techniques. All of a sudden, you have predicate logic that came to the fore because of the work of a German logician by the name of Gottlieb Frege. And it was interesting. It was very exciting. I mean, the analytical school of philosophy was something that began to really come out as being a way of offering a new direction in philosophical thinking, away from something that was a little bit more standard, like, for example, just studying the history of philosophical doctrines and trying to look at them from within. Whereas, the 20th century philosophers were, at least the Anglo-American ones, were very interested in showing where there were confusions in philosophical thinking and trying to clarify and offer a kind of a therapy, if you will, to some of the philosophical speculations that had been put forward. I mean, parallel to that, obviously, you had a much different approach on the continent, because in the early part of the 20th century, you had Martin Heidegger in Being and Time, and that was a really important book, and he is a deeply an important philosopher, but coming from a completely opposite point of view, such that the discussion or the dialogue between, let's say, Heideggerians and analytic philosophers almost as fated to fail because they can't seem to have a common ground. Where we are right now, I think it's interesting. There are a lot of important discussions that have come forward in debates. Much of it has to do with human freedom and human consciousness, and whether or not something like neuroscience and the laws of physics can point to the absence of human freedom, and that in the end, we really do not have that kind of identity or personality that we think we have. Everything is kind of the result of all of the conditions that operate both within and within us and our surrounding environment. But I do think, nevertheless, there are always these individuals and in particular moments where new ideas seem to come forward. And so I think that to the extent that philosophy is still an activity that's going on, and it's not being shall we say prevented or suffocated by overarching doctrines and overarching methods, as long as the philosophical spirit is able to percolate a little bit and begin to look in different directions, everything will be good. What's really important not to happen is that one final doctrine, one final method just simply dismisses any opportunity to deviate from what's thought to be standard and official. And unfortunately, I mean, it is the case, unfortunately, when big departments in universities try to carve out an identity, frequently they will dismiss alternative approaches, like, for example, phenomenology. Phenomenology would not be a method that most universities in the United States would embrace as genuinely philosophical, because it's too intuitive, it's too descriptive. It doesn't, it's something that was more like poetic or in the framework of literature, and not something that is quasi-scientific. In the contemporary field, when you look at analytic philosophy and so forth, you begin to see that there's this incredible attempt to try to make philosophy more like science. And and that's where that's perfectly fine, to the extent that we're still probing and trying to get answers, but to the point where we're absolutely trying to dismiss alternatives and to beat our chest and say we have the final truth. Well, of course, that would be counterproductive. So I'm still very optimistic. I do think, as long as students come in and have an open mind and are willing to take and kind of question maybe some of their most deeply held assumptions, for the purpose not of creating confusion, but for the purpose of seeing whether there might be alternative approaches, alternative points of view that might be very rewarding and helpful. As long as we don't come in with closed minds, we'll be fine. Now, going back to the 1980s, you may or may not be familiar with the work of Alban Bloom. Alban Bloom was a classical scholar at the University of Chicago. He actually gave a translation of Plato's Republic. He wrote a book in the late 1980s called The Closing of the American Mind. And while that text is really kind of an interesting text that talks about aspects within political philosophy, what Bloom, I think, was pointing to is the fact that at some point, it just seems that the humanities, not just philosophy, but the humanities, seem to be dismissed as kind of chitter chatter. I mean, it's something that's cocktail talk, cocktail party talk. It's not anything that could be deeply important to the individual. And what I think we find right now is that, especially when it comes to positions in business and finance and elsewhere, that people who don't have a strong background, a grounding in humanistic thinking, and that comes through philosophy, but also literature, but also history, also music, right? When you don't have that, you find that you are pretty much thinking like everybody else, and you have a very narrow focus, and genuine insight, genuine creativity, a genuine spontaneity and insight might not be that accessible to you. And there are a number of individuals who have done well in philosophy and have become very effective and very successful in fields like business, journalism, and elsewhere. So Alex Trebek was the guy on Jeopardy. Well, he was a philosophy major, right? No surprise. But I'm just saying there are plenty of people like that who, because they came in to the discipline with an open mind and did not just think that all important questions had been answered, that allowed them to discover possibilities within themselves that they might not have known even existed. You see, and I think that's the thing that we really have to think about. What are the things of which we are capable, but that has not yet been revealed to us because we've been following a kind of standard pattern, a pattern of expectations that have come to us from outside. So this is what philosophy can open the door to oneself, and to see that there are things that one can explore and grow from that otherwise might not have been self-evident.
Yeah, no, it's that's a very powerful ending to that answer. There's two things that I couldn't help but think about. One is my my first real exposure to someone that because where I live is very small, so I don't meet a whole lot of different individuals. But my first sort of exposure to someone who is not very interested in history or literature, and more so just like you said, going along with the flow, that has come recently, and it's been very fascinating to try and sort of connect and mesh with that individual. And then the other thing I wanted to bring up was my my exposure to analytic philosophy has been very recent too. My first exposure to it, and it is sort of this very interesting feeling, doing the work and learning about it. I, it's hard for me to come up with a question on the fly, but do you feel not necessarily that it's repressive, but do you feel as if that is too over scientific analytic philosophy?
No, no, not necessarily. One way to look at this question is, to look at um, the traditional, you might say, presentation of how the human mind works with the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. Correct. So if you know that general presentation, and again, the scientific validity of that separation of left hemisphere, right hemisphere thinking is certainly something that's going to have to be reviewed and maybe even challenged. But one portrayal of this is that the left hemisphere is something that governs a lot of our tactical, analytical, scientific, fact gathering form of thinking, and that the right hemisphere is much more intuitive, much more creative, and so forth. And I do think that analytic philosophy certainly has its merits. What it allows us to do is to go deeply into, you might say, the infrastructure of any kind of point of view, and to kind of see how the ideas are aligned, and whether they are coherent or not, if there's any kind of integrity within the proposals that are being put forward. And all of that is extremely important. The flip side of that, however, is that all of this analytical, technical, logical thinking nonetheless requires some type of perspective, some type of theoretical insight or vision. In philosophy of science, not that long ago, the main idea that was put forward, one of the main ideas was that any particular statement of experience, any empirical statement like the sky is blue, is nonetheless theory laden, and you cannot say whether that statement is true or false independently of some adoption of theoretical first principles. And so I think, and those theoretical first principles are, they're intuitive, and they're something that either we take on or we reject. And so the point here is that as long as we can see that there's got to be really a type of, you might say, a union or a complementarity coming from both the more theoretical, the more intuitive, the more perspectival side of things, together with the analytical and deeply incisive and deeply scientific aspect of thinking. When they both align, that's where we get a much more complete picture. Now, sometimes it's going to be clear that the drama of a particular perspective is going to be something that may overshadow some of the internal mechanics and internal inquiry, talking about the structure of ideas and the structure of arguments. But nevertheless, we have to be able to size that up and see what is more important. Take something, for example, like the question of abortion. Okay, whether or not the practice of abortion is morally justifiable. Now, we can build arguments, that prove that abortion is morally unjustifiable and that it's morally justifiable. And internally, those arguments are going to be absolutely strong. What's going to differentiate them is going to be, the background, the theoretical perspective that we have regarding, let's say, human life. What is human life? Is it something that must of necessity be protected from any kind of early termination or not? Does a human life begin at conception, or is it something that even if it begins at conception has or it doesn't have rights? Well, these are all kinds of things that you really have to ponder. But if it becomes clear that it is morally justifiable to terminate a life, even at conception or thereafter, if we can find some type of model that would suggest this, then the idea that uninhibited abortion would be acceptable would not be difficult to establish. So the point I'm trying to make here is that we can be mesmerized and sometimes seduced by the subtlety of argumentation. Okay, because a well-designed argument is just like a well-designed mathematical theorem. I mean, it's something that takes time and it takes finesse. Okay, so you have, and we can be overpowered by the technical expertise that comes out of a well-designed argument. But we must not lose sight of the fact that in the background here, there are some important, perspectives and theoretical visions in which these arguments, they are nestled within, and they take their root within those perspectives. Nothing is established, like in a vacuum. There's not just this kind of sense of, we could argue, openly without any assumptions being made. That's not the case. And so when we take both sides, the more theoretical, intuitive, first principles approach, we say this is what we're beginning with, and then we begin to see, well, what kind of argumentative strategy can we take on? Then at that point of view, it'll make sense. I'll just give me another afterthought on this. If you remember, studying Plato and Socrates, Socrates was the kind of person who would probe individuals for answers to questions, and particularly he would take on the question of definitions. What is the definition of piety, for example, like in the Euthyphro? Okay, and no one can come up with a decent definition. And what Socrates shows is that there are all kind of inconsistencies in the definitions. But what Socrates didn't really do, even though he did that really hard work of teasing out and showing inconsistencies in argumentation, he did not put forward a type of a theoretical model that would allow for some kind of resolution. This is what Plato did. Plato brought in the theory of forms. Plato's argument was, if you're going to talk about piety, there has to be a form of piety, okay, that exists in a world of forms. And so therefore we could look at what might be pious or impious in this world, and we could resolve issues of what are acts of piety or impiety in reference to the form that would exist in the world of forms. Absent that, we are just talking about internal consistencies or inconsistencies, but we don't have a sense as to where all of that kind of wrangling and discussion actually takes root. And that's why a more comprehensive understanding of what it is we are about to begin with, that we can then delve into and resolve issues of such as piety or impiety. So I think the theoretical, intuitive, assumptions that we have to make in order to move ahead in argumentation, we can't just simply dismiss them. They have to be taken into account.
Yeah, no, that makes complete sense. And talking about a specific argument, I can never say Jean-Paul Sartre's name correctly. It always makes me very embarrassed, but
it's okay.
His one of his most famous ideas is existence preceding essence, and
Right.
funnily enough, just got done talking about Plato. That idea has always fascinated me, and when I first heard about it, it was very mind-blowing, to put it simply. Do you feel as if that's a misguided notion and sort of this fundamental battle between someone like Plato and Sartre?
Well, I think I think it's a very interesting proposal. I think it's something we have to take very seriously because, again, the idea in the background here is that, well, first of all, in Sartre, it's pretty much straightforward. He says, well, first of all, I'm an atheist. Okay, so there's no There's no acceptance of any kind of God. In fact, he tries to show how the idea of a God or all perfect being is itself self-contradictory. I don't have to go into the specifics of that, but the point is that there is a sense that we are living in a kind of a void. That's the theoretical background here. If we're living in a void, if there's no purpose to anything that exists, now that's a really strong assumption. That's a really strong point of departure. Then it's clear that if there's anything that we can build, it'll be our own identity. It'll be our own essential self. And further, the next important step in that view is that if we can have an identity, if we can have something that we call our own, it will be through our decisions and our actions. Our actions are in the end what's going to build our essence, so to speak. Now, there's a lot of theory and a lot of certain levels of assumptions, I would say, or first principles that play into this. That actions are important, and that in the end we are condemned to be free. Sartre says we are condemned to be free, and we have this absolute freedom. And and from that point of view, if all of that were true, if there's no God, there's no purpose to anything. The only thing that could create a genuine personal human identity is deliberative thinking that leads to actions for which we take responsibility, and then we are pretty much building like Lego pieces, our identity with the different actions we have taken responsibility for and so forth. All that does, of course, make sense. However, it still does raise the question of, well, maybe there is still some kind of purpose to human existence. Maybe there is a kind of, you might say, some level of importance in our nature that comes to us from some other source. So again, a person like Kierkegaard or others, or some theological thinkers might suggest that we do have a divinely granted type of human purpose, and and it may be something associated with making our existence in the world, throughout all human communities, better and more spiritual rather than more material. There are a lot of things that could be put forward, but I think what Sartre has done, and done very effectively, I think it's got a lot to do again with what happened in Europe during the Second World War. Is you have something so drastic and so horrific, as the Hitler's final solution and the things that were taking place, that it suggests almost dramatically and almost intuitively that the curtain has been drawn. There's nothing on the stage, and there's no one there. We're living in a void and emptiness. And what are our choices? Our choices are like suicide, or to go forward and to make the world a better place through our own deliberations and our own taking responsibility. And that notion of taking responsibility for one's actions, not living in a world of what Sartre called bad faith, that's very, very insightful. That's, I think, very, very helpful. And one can take that and either be or not be an existentialist, but just say that when we do the things that we do, are we operating on autopilot, or are we really reflecting on the gravity of what it is that we are embracing? Are we just being part of a mob, we're just sort of like storming the Capitol or whatever it is? Or are we actually realizing that we can't point to others to take responsibility for what we're doing? We have to stand accounted. And what's another thing that's beautiful, what Sartre says, is that when we do make these very personal and independent decisions, we are indirectly or even directly showing to others how they too ought to decide. So it's almost as though we are indirectly providing a type of a pseudo obligation to others, and realizing that this is something that we do have to take responsibility for giving that kind of example to others. And if we think that, and then we can't say, well, it's just me who thinks this. No, when you make a decision and you decide to do something that's really grave and impactful, you are, says Sartre, indirectly, showing to others that this is what they ought to do in that same kind of situation, which is very, very, I think, again, interesting and problematic. but it shows that, and what I really think what comes out of Sartre and many other philosophical theories is that when you take an idea and you take it to an extreme, and you take one aspect of life and you just take that thing to an extreme, like Sartre says, nothing matters, right? We are basically alone, and it makes no sense whatsoever to be frivolous or to be nihilistic. That's self-defeating. So we have to take on these battles ourselves and make decisions. That's taking an idea really to an extreme. But you know what? And when we do this and compare it to other ways of thinking, we might see a glimmer of truth that appears in these other points of view that might seem to be quite opposite to what someone like Sartre would hold. What I'm getting at here is that sometimes it seems that you have to take almost an extreme radical position to bring our attention to certain dimensions in the way we think and operate in the world, and which otherwise might simply be be recessed. In other words, be hidden to us and not be thought of as being important. And so that's why I think existence before essence is really important, because prior to that, prior to all of that, the opposite was true. Like if you go into the 19th century and 18th century, you look at people like Hegel. And remember, Kierkegaard was operating and pretty much debating Hegel. Hegel was saying that everything is rational, everything is essential, essence is everything, and existence is really nothing. And of course, Kierkegaard tried to flip that discussion, and of course Sartre did too, especially within the context of Europe in the mid 20th century. But those radical positions, each of them, I think, can point to some aspect of their way of thinking that might ring true to us, even if we do not accept all that they are suggesting. And I think it's how philosophy works sometimes. Sometimes you just have to go to an extreme in making a point and trying to open up a space, in the philosophical dialogue, to show that there is this area that needs to be taken into account. That truth is somehow has to be built around these nuggets of insight that we find, from different philosophical schemes. As I said before, you look at the 20th century. In the 20th century, you had this fascination with logical argumentation and how you could, unpack meanings and show where there were inconsistencies, whereas before that didn't seem to be possible. So now we can say, in the end, logic is nothing but argumentation, right? And then you remember in reading in the course, in the Philosophies of Life course, Nietzsche is famous for saying, well, life is not an argument, right? So in the gay science, Nietzsche goes, no, it's not an argument. Life is something that's much more complex and much more, involved than pure, simple argumentation. And I think, when you look at dedicated argumentation, dedicated logic, you can be fascinated by that. You can throw your life behind that, or you could be like Heidegger, and you could be saying, ask the question, why is there being rather than non-being? Just that question itself. So it's very a powerful question. It really is. It's why is there something that exists rather than non-exist? And then you begin to probe into other areas and take the view that, of course, Heidegger took in relation to Plato, that truth is not, something that comes through a whole chain of reasoning, but a truth is, this idea of aletheia. In other words, this shall we say, shadowing. It's this allowing things to speak. In phenomenology, the argument is, or the approach is, to allow things to come speak to us rather than us imposing our categories and our structures upon what it is we're trying to understand. There is truth in both. I mean, really, I think, at some point we need to be able to be a little bit versatile and understand the limitations of any particular way of thinking, and to be humble, but also at the same time be receptive of that particular contribution that can be made, and not to canonize and not to sanctify it or anything like that, not to turn it into some kind of doctrine, but to realize that that level of versatility and receptivity of ideas is really what's really central. And so that's why I like Sartre. And by the way, I can tell you that Sartre, at the end of his life, when he was being interviewed, there's a very famous film on Jean-Paul Sartre, done by a French filmmaker, came out in the 1970s. Sartre died in 1980. Where Sartre was saying, hey, I always said that, we were free, we were absolutely free, and existence comes before essence. But I tend to think now that I can understand that there's sometimes, free choice is going to be limited by the conditions in which one lives, right? And so at least he was warming up to the idea that, although it's a beautiful idea to think that we are totally, completely free at all moments to make decisions for which we are going to be held accountable, that may be a beautiful idea, but it may not actually be as true as we would like it to be. So we have to learn from the social sciences, we have to learn from physical science, we have to be humble ourselves in what we accept as being true in the end.
Right. Yeah, I as I was reviewing for this, I had just read that he did not necessarily walk back the idea, but like you said, became more receptive to possibly other ideas. I there's there is that sort of unlimited freedom that he offers, and I really enjoyed how, again, it sort of gets back to Dostoevsky in a way where Sartre is hinting at this sort of implicit responsibility for others. I kind of want to linger there and ask how he comes about that idea. Does he sort of just mention it like as an aside, say like, hey, if you do this, this other good thing is going to happen too, or is that more elaborate from him, if that makes sense?
So I think what you're getting at is this notion that it would be interesting if let's say if I'm confronted with a terrorist, and I have to either hand over a person to the terrorist who's asking to take that person as a hostage, or perhaps stand up and take a bullet and allow the would-be hostage to escape. That's a very critical decision. If I make the decision to confront the terrorist and die by it, and thereby allowing the would-be hostage to be free, or if I turn over the hostage to the terrorist and I'm allowed to go free. Sartre would say, well, that's a decision, of course, that is personal, and there's no obvious right or wrong thing to do from any kind of theory that we would accept. It would be nice to have all the right answers, in a book. We just look them up and then we just, carry them out and think that that's how it's supposed to be done. Obviously, Sartre dismisses that. So he puts us right there in the throes of that kind of anguishing decision-making context. But what's really important is that to give even greater seriousness to that decision, that's supposed to be almost, paradigmatic for humans, who are going to be in similar situations. In other words, I think what Sartre wants to establish here, and that's been said many times before, that subjectivity is intersubjectivity. But that, I mean, is that we are all part of, the human community. We are all individuals as humans. We're all facing the same kind of, problems to a certain degree, or at least the same kind of challenges, although the contexts are going to be different. But, we have to, take on at various stages in our lives different challenges that are inevitably going to come our way. So to kind of think that we are disassociated and we are somehow living in a vacuum, and that the decision that we are making only relates to us and doesn't relate to others, is just being, disingenuous. His point is that, we cannot deny the fact that, our human existence is a dynamic reality, and so we are not separated, at least in terms of let's say we obviously space and time will have separation, but the thing he's trying to get at here is that it's through praxis, it's through practice, not through some kind of godly given essence, but it's through our engagement in situations that we really are human, and that we share our common humanity by practically being thrown into this kind of void where we have to come up with solutions. And so I think that emphasis upon choosing for self is also choosing for all humanity is a recognition that regardless of anything else, we are practically in the same kinds of situations at some point or another, and if not, we are nevertheless being forced in a situation to make a stand, to take a stand, and to make a statement that defines us as humans, not as in one person, but in our humanity. And our humanity is just like our essence is built. In other words, it's constructed through these choices that we make. So I think it's now some people might argue, and I think it's a fair point, that maybe that's going too far. Maybe Sartre is being a little bit romantic here and thinking that somehow we are connected with humans and we can't but make decisions for ourselves and for all humans. But I think there's a strong insight from Sartre. I think it is a little bit disingenuous to think that we are so different from everybody else that nothing that we do really has to have any kind of impact or any kind of guidance to others. I think experience shows that that's not the case. We all are directly or indirectly impacted, influenced by various individuals in the world, either in a positive or a negative way. So I think practically speaking, he's right. He's right that we are indeed in a situation where when we act in a certain way, we are, if we're doing it deliberatively, if we're doing it existentially, if we're really anguishing over what it is we're doing, and we're trying to come up with a genuine position that we are going to embrace, it's almost disingenuous and almost frivolous or cavalier to think, well, it's just me, and it's not for anybody else, because how are you so different from everybody else? And that's I think something that can't really be taken seriously. We're all, it's at some level, we have a kind of a shared identity, not through the form of an essence, but through our being thrown into the world, in a world where there is no purpose, says Sartre, and in facing decisions that we have to make as persons. I think that's the common you might say core of our human existence.
Yeah, that's very insightful. Towards the end there, I couldn't help but think about there's a Doors lyric. I'm forgetting which song all of a sudden, but it just says, "Into this world we're thrown," and
Right.
that lyric always resonated with me in this sort of sphere.
Right.
So shifting away a little bit now, AI is very, very growing fast,
Sure.
rapidly, and it seems as if there's news about it every day. It's being incorporated into social media quite a bit with memes and whatnot. Do you feel as if it's going to radically sort of reshape the world we think about philosophically? For me, I've sort of tried to walk some of these things out, and it feels to me as if it will. But I wanted to ask if you feel that
Yeah.
way.
Yeah. I mean, I artificial intelligence, the whole process of trying to develop artificial models of intelligence, that's been going on for a fair number of years. I think even I can remember, even as a younger person, reading about a robot that was being built at MIT. I think it was called Shaky or something like this. It was a long time ago. It was an article in Life magazine, and one of the reporters was asking the MIT scientist, saying, well, what do you think, what happens if Shaky becomes so intelligent that he's more intelligent than humans and could take power over humans? And the MIT scientist responded by saying, I'm going to stand on the side of intelligence no matter what form it's in. So that's interesting. It's an interesting point of view. Now, that was something like decades ago. Now, you have people like Robert Kurzweil over, I think he too was at MIT, who's built this thing called the singularity thesis. If you don't know it, you should take a look at it. But the singularity thesis is basically this idea that at some point, the difference between human and robot, or human and machine intelligence, won't be that obvious. So I tend to think, that artificial intelligence will certainly develop in so many different ways. It will be difficult at times to find a deep distinction between what is machine-like and what's human-like. and we all know about the Alan Turing test. We know that Alan Turing, developed this test, and some people claim that they've successfully shown that people cannot sometimes differentiate between responses to questions given by humans and then given by robots or computers. What I think is going to be really interesting, and it's going to be very fascinating to watch, will be the level at which robots could actually develop genuine forms of consciousness compared to human consciousness. Okay, so that's an open question, and there's a lot of debate in the field right now whether or not there's the possibility that no matter how quick in calculating and running, regressions and things like that computers are able to do, that the massive amount of information that they can compile and so forth, but being able to achieve consciousness and awareness, self-awareness, that I think is going to be very interesting, because that basically comes back to the question of whether or not we have a mind or a soul in us beyond our brains, in our biochemical processes. So that's one thing, and then the other thing I think is going to be really interesting to see is can machines be programmed in such a way so that they can actually have genuine, intuitive, and you might say creative functions, so that they're not just simply comparing and contrasting, analyzing, aggregating, disaggregating data, forms of data, but they're actually able to step away from that and kind of synthesize and see and use a certain kind of intuition to make to give a different reading on the various amounts of data that come in. This is what I was saying before about this idea of the right hemisphere with this left hemisphere. I mean, you can have all kinds of data thrown before you, correct, and it all can make sense. But when you begin to pull it together and you provide it a theoretical superstructure, then all that data gets its meaning, right, from the energy that gets from that particular perspective that you're bringing down. But why would you take one perspective or one theoretical vision over another? See, that's very creative. That's very intuitive. That's almost a question of individual freedom. So freedom, consciousness, intuition, those are going to be the really interesting things to see if at some point that can happen. If not, I think humans will still have an edge over machines to a certain degree. I mean, obviously, if you have a whole army of AI, robots and mercenaries or soldiers, and they're coming after you. I mean, obviously, that's just brute force. Brute force is always going to have some high levels of success. But I think, in the end, I think we can look to various examples in human history and in our own lives to see where does subtlety, or let's say intuition, creativity, that kind of thing, where would have a little bit of an edge over just the operation or the demonstration of brute force. So I do think there's a lot to be gained from AI. I think it's a wonderful thing. I think we have to go very, tread carefully. And then, the president of the United States, as you know, most recently trying to put out some restrictions on how developments in AI are going to be carried out, and what kind of reporting has to be done to the U.S. government, so that advances in AI are not going to be things that lead to problems, in human culture. But I think at the same time, it's important to be very enthusiastic about this, and to try to leverage the advantages and not be taken up or consumed by the disadvantages. For example, in this artificial intelligence, this generative AI was like Chat GPT and so forth. I think those tools can be very, very helpful. I mean, I think if you can, and of course, doctors, as a matter of fact, and use expert systems when they are trying to diagnose symptoms. They'll put in the symptoms sometimes in an expert system to see what comes out of that, because they can't always know what combination of symptoms, what it actually means, what it might mean in many different cases. So when they throw in that data, they get something back, and they can kind of compare that to their individual patient, and it can be a kind of a collaboration, okay, of something that's much more mechanical and data driven, and what's much more insightful, because the medical doctor knows the patient better than maybe than any other professional. So I think it's going to be a question of being able to achieve complementarity and collaboration, and not to be dismissive of what AI can do, because we all know, I mean, human intelligence is limited. I mean, there's so many things that we can calculate in our mind, but the machines can do a whole lot of a better job of that. So this is a question of a partnership, I think, and to the extent that it can stay a partnership, I think it's going to be very, very helpful.
Yeah, no, that's I've heard many people in the AI field talk about how the the main goal and drive is sort of to have AI be sort of the best mentor of all time in a way, the best collaborator, and that would be great. There is the concern of you mentioned earlier on of it potentially outshining human intelligence. Obviously that's probably too hard to tell at the moment, but the one thing worth mentioning is um Sam Altman consistently, he's the CEO of OpenAI. He
Oh
consistently
yeah.
does public discussions and conversations with others on the internet, and he was asked if he feels ChatGPT 3.5 is conscious, and he said he did not know.
Mhm.
um I'm not sure if that was for the shock factor, or if that was his genuine feeling, which, if that's the case, it still is this debate on whether what consciousness is in general. Um,
Mhm.
I think that was worth mentioning.
Mhm.
Yeah, the singularity is something that I do have to read up more on. I've
Mhm.
I've only heard that fleetingly. So speaking of heading into the future, you've mentioned living abroad and you have vast experience, educating younger people, these sorts of things. I just wanted to ask what sort of advice you have for people in and around my age.
Right. Well, I mean, I think it's really important, to the extent that one can do this, is to have experiences that are going to put us in a, in a situation where we're not necessarily comfortable or able to rely on your dedicated or prefabricated, methods or or solutions to issues, but things that will force us to kind of adapt and grow in meaningful ways. And I do think this can be done domestically. It doesn't, one does not have to go live in a foreign country to have this happen. I think, young people who go off and do volunteer, assignments, or get, internships in businesses where they're really being taken on and have to work in a very fast-paced environment. Whatever it is, I think it's important to be able to not just carry on, in an everyday kind of mode, but to step outside and to create those opportunities where you're going to be challenged and you're going to possibly be, let's say, criticized for, ineffectiveness, so that you can understand where your limitations are and where you need to kind of build some strengths and some skills. I think that's really what's important. Of course, living abroad in a foreign country can be something that provides that, working in different in different professions, or maybe working different vocations or different jobs that are going to force you to have to respond in a foreign language and deal with people that you would ordinarily deal with, let's say, in your own country. All these things are really, really helpful. I mean, I think, again, going back to someone like Alan Bloom in the closing of The American Mind, I think he mentions, if I recall correctly, that in his generation, it was commonplace for people to want to get out of the United States, to want to go spend some time in a different country, to see, to breathe, to experience a foreign culture as a way of just becoming a more complete human being. Like, Ernest Hemingway, writes about all these things that he did, go running with the bulls in Pamplona, Spain, something like that. I mean, it sounds kind of romantic, but, I mean, being able to do something like that, that's not restricted to the genuine tourism, but really it means you're taking some risks and you're trying to fit in and you're trying to learn from what a different environment has to teach you. I think that's the most important thing. Now, of course, there's the fear factor, and the fear factor is, I don't know if I can handle it, and I don't know if what I would do, what I would break down, or something like that. So there is a certain level of self-assessment one has to do. One should not take on any kind of endeavor that's going to be overpowering and then prevent the individual from really advancing and growing. But I think that's a question of self-assessment. We have to ask ourselves when we're ready to do this and when we're not, but not to just simply live enclosed in a kind of a comfortable environment and thinking that that's the ticket, for happiness. That's the ticket for, for full human flourishing. I don't think it is. I think, we all have weaknesses and we all don't want those weaknesses to be exposed, but to the extent that they end up being exposed and we can take them face on and we can begin to realize how we can overcome them and grow much more completely as a person, that's going to be very much to our advantage. And so that can be done, as I said, domestically, or it can be done, by going off and living in a foreign country, or a combination of the two, but not staying put and just simply, allowing things to, like, time and space to kind of just carry us through. I think that's the more dangerous approach.
Yeah, that is that's something that I definitely need to assess myself on. I've been lived in one spot for quite a long time, and obviously I mean, I've got goals to go
Right.
other places, and I I have been lucky enough to go to other places and sort of see different cultures and whatnot. Hmm, would you say that I mean, you just mentioned that it's not necessarily abroad or domestically. Would you say that abroad is going to be, obviously it's going to be the bigger challenge. I'm trying I'm trying to put this into a neat way. Is that something you feel someone, obviously speaking for humanity is difficult, but is that something you feel someone should do, not necessarily live in another country, but go see another country at least once in their life?
Oh, I think so. I think so. I mean, I think for most people it could be a good experience. Again, even if it's at the level of tourism. I mean, that's a first step. At least going off and visiting another country and maybe practicing the foreign language before you go there and trying to make an effort to communicate and learn from people. I think that's another way of just stepping out of the comfort zone. And this is what I'm trying to relate to is to not be too comfortable in how we're living today and just think that that's everything's hunky dory and this is how it ought to be. It's not the case. I mean, there's a lot we can learn from other people, other cultures, and learn about ourselves and learn about them. So I think, it would be unfortunate if someone had to be sequestered and confined within a certain geography in one's entire life. There might be something to be gained from that. I'm not saying it's totally tragic or anything like that, but I just think in general, especially young people who are going through a college education, if you're going through a college education, you really should, I think, have some exposure to a foreign culture, a foreign language, a different way of thinking, because we're living in a very globalized society to begin with. I mean, if we don't have a sense of how other nations look at us, how other people think about us as Americans and so forth, if we're living in that kind of a little protective bubble, I just think it's kind of dangerous. I don't think it's a very a practical way to do things. I'm not saying you can't get away with doing that. Maybe you can, but I just don't think it's fully advantageous. I would just say at least having some exposure to otherness and to understanding why otherness might have an advantage, perhaps to a certain degree, over how we do things. That could be very, enlightening, can be, eye-opening, and I think that's the whole point. I mean, in some ways, I think philosophy and travel really go hand in glove. I mean, for myself, that was certainly when I was living in Europe and I was teaching in Switzerland for 3 years. I took my students all around the world. I took them to China, I took them to Spain, I took them to Greece several times, to Egypt. And I really believe in, in doing this, because I think that this is how, again, we expand our horizons. We expand our horizons physically, through travel. We were able, to confront novelty and to kind of see if we're prepared to take it in and to react to it. We expand our horizons mentally by, reading things that we wouldn't necessarily read for fun, taking, like a play from Shakespeare, or reading, Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit or something like that, or Aristotle's Metaphysics. This is not stuff that we necessarily read for fun, but we do these things because we realize that there are incredible potentials that we have within ourselves. There are things that we can grow from, but in order to do that, we have to be willing to take certain risks and to do some hard work and be ready to shore up our energies for that expansion, if you will, of understanding, our expansion of awareness. As that, and in doing that, I think we become more complete and more fulfilled people.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. I'm ready to go to a travel agency right now for sure.
Or you study abroad office at the University of Delaware. I mean, obviously, there are plenty of things that are being offered, I believe, in winter session. So, I mean,
Yeah,
one could do that. I know,
yeah,
I know Dr. Urbanus at UD Dover. She's doing a travel course to Italy, although I think it's fully booked right now. But she is focusing, I think, on Italy in the winter.
yeah. I'll definitely have to take a look at some things. Yeah, that got me ready to get up and go explore. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. For you giving me a chance for a conversation. That was
Sure.
very enjoyable.